Just to give some background in terms of how Father felt about what was happening and his own explanation for how he reacted to what was happening in the independence movement. He describes himself as, my attitude toward the fight was that of a sheltered individual from a conservative family, drawn from the secure seclusion of Irish life to the responsibility of action. And the words responsibility of action are something that we all need to be conscious of in our own lives. And you'll see what he did when he saw the occasion to go for action. And I just plead with you all to think that anyone and all of us have a responsibility for action in our own lives and to our society. His was rather dramatic, as we will see, because you know, when he read of the 1916, he went out that night without prior sanctioning, either from his family, who God knows wouldn't allow him out, or from having joined any organization, because he was not an Irish volunteer, but he took action. He was impelled to do it. Some of you may have seen the Win the Chicks, the Barley, and that describes some of Father's life. Not a precise memoir, but some of the attitudes and the working conditions that those fellows had to do, fighting in their own way and for their own cause. And when there was a split, each of them felt sincerely about their particular cause which they followed. Later, this was a quote that Father did in summarizing his own experience. He said, "We really worked on a kind of crusade in which you left your home, your real friends, then your social environment and all of the amenities. One had to stop reading literature, prevent oneself from making friends, and travel in your own narrow circle. And it's what I call tough." The narrow circle is an interesting thing, because we all have to watch that out too as we get into our own lives and what you pursue, and you can become too narrow. I think the narrowness there was referring to the activities of the soldier on the run, in which you live it only with your own kind and do your own things, and you're not able to get back into the normalized society of finding out what happens in the real world, which is the non-fighting world. And I think one of the things that we'll find about in the Civil War is those who are fighting on both sides really didn't have good feedback, honest feedback from those who they were defending. And so I think things dragged on too long. Anyway, when you think of what that, and much of his own writing, I've come to the conclusion that, and indeed I found recently his pension application sent from New York, written out by a doctor. And if you were to put that before a doctor today, you would say definitely that he had post-traumatic stress disorder. Never wanted to settle down, was always moving, had no particular objective in life, traveled from state to state and lived in house to house. Though he wanted to come back to Ireland, he actually didn't until he finally met a person who gave him a cause that he should come back and get a pension, namely my mother. So just going back in terms of the chronology of where he was and what he was doing, family comes up in 1906, he goes to the National Christian Brothers School in Dublin, gets a strong nationalist input. So though there's conservative feeling at home, you get this nationalist stream coming through the education. Now, again, these two causes are vying with each other, and so you'll find that whereas the family makes fun of the Irish volunteers and the organization of what is happening in the North, certainly in his writing, he never says that he has any empathy with those who have done this. But suddenly in 1916, he comes down to Nelson's Pillar, reads the proclamation, and is astounded to read words such as Ireland should be for the Irish. The very fact that that is astounding to a young man gives us some indication of how conservative Irish society was, And particularly if you didn't, I mean, there are those families who have, let's call Fenian blood in them, who have gone tradition and they've fought for these things. They have fought for generations against the Pale. No one in the Malley family ever fought against the Pale. They were conservative, small-time farmers, lucky to be alive, have enough potatoes to go. If their sons get some modest education, that's fine. So, you know, for him to come back and read face-to-face with a document, which is on the foot of Nelson's pillar, and that afternoon sort of decide not to go back and defend Trinity College as he had been invited to by some of his friends. Medical school students were in Temple Bar and Trinity College, so they mingled in the local cafes or tea houses, and so he knew people there. And again, some of his friends had gone to Trinity, so they were just sort of saying, come on, and they didn't really know what was happening. They said, we might be attacked, come help us. He didn't really think about it too much. He went home for dinner, and on the way home, somebody had sort of said to him, why would you go fight for Trinity? That's the opposition. You'll be fighting against Irishmen. That's not your tradition. And so, I guess in his memoir, he simply says he didn't go back to Trinity. He stayed, and within 2 days, he finds another friend who whispers to him very quietly that he has a Mauser. At least he knows where there's a Mauser gun and a rifle, and if he came with him that night, they would go defending Dublin from the British, as the British were coming down the quays. And that's where he is being called to the responsibility of action. He's 19-year-old, he climbs out of the bedroom at night, and he's sort of out fighting in an unorganized way from the British Army. Could have popped him off, and then I wouldn't be here lecturing. Not to mention other consequences. So he's gotten a scholarship, and I should say that the reason that he is not out fighting in the British Army, like his two brothers, is that he got a scholarship. Well, he didn't need to make that economic decision. His parents didn't need to pay his fees to get to UCD medicine. He got a scholarship. So as far as the balance sheet with the family, he was a free ride because he was awesome costing them. Now, he didn't bring income in, as his brothers might have done in sending their military pay home to a family of 11 with all of the financial needs. But he stayed on at the university, and he, as after Easter week changed, he identifies in his memoir how you could sort of see somebody and recognize with the eyes or something that they were nationalists, as opposed to the rest, most of the university, 95% were not nationalists. So by not being nationalists, I don't say anything wrong about that. They were just normal Irish people who were not concerned with the movement that was going on. So it was a very small percentage, both in Mayo and in the countryside generally, as well as at a university setting, who were called to the responsibility of action. Anyway, he continued for a while, and eventually just felt he wasn't doing very well in his studies. That may have been one of the factors, but he also was reading more. He's seeing how the Sinn Féin activity was becoming more of a critical element in Irish society, how the prospects for the IPP could be defeated. And so the Irish Parliamentary Party, who were sort of standing behind the Home Rule. So the whole point about the Irish Volunteers was not to take the constitutional approach to owning Ireland, which was maybe in the future the British would sanction the giving of a certain portion of Ireland back to the Irish. They wanted to have their own revolution to create and take and seize the opportunity of having an independent Irish government. So he basically went on the run 1918 in March and worked for Michael Collins and Richard Mulcahy. Went over throughout the country from north to south, east to west, went on duties over in London, and eventually was about to be given responsibility for whole section of the country in the south. But Mulcahy sent him on one last tour of duty, which was to organize, and his functions in this period was to organize the brigades and the companies around Ireland. He was told to go down to take care of the Kilkenny Brigade, which according to local management was a disaster. Anyway, so Father went down, took all of his careful notes, started to have a plan. The house was surrounded. The guards for the evening didn't alert him that the troops were coming. He was captured. He had his guns on him. He had the maps. He had all of the names of all of the neighbors and responsibilities. So it was a total disaster. And in the press, and many years later, the Kilkenny people accused Father of telling misinformation about the Kilkenny people, such as that their guards didn't alert him that he was about to be surrounded. What had happened is they just fled, you know, saving their own skins, hadn't thought to report into the house that they were protecting and alerting him, so Father did not have time to put all the papers away. The consequences of that were, and it could have happened to any organizer, was that everyone in Kilkenny was rounded up because the British had the list of who's who. So it was really very tragic, not to mention what happened to Father having been captured. He was accused of having a gun, which he did, but they didn't really know whose handwriting was on the table or whose notes. They could have been anyone in the room, and they couldn't read the handwriting because he had terrible handwriting, so they just tried to identify who he was, where his mother lived. He wouldn't tell them anything. He went under the false name of Bernard Stewart, and so eventually, after sort of 6 weeks of poor treatment, mistreatment in both Kilkenny and in Dublin Castle, he was led out to pasture in Kilmainham jail. He had had severe treatment, red hot pokers on his eyeballs, bayonets on his belly, being shot against a wall with blanks, various other things which in these days would be deemed to be torture, and even then was torture. But Michael Collins comes to his rescue, hears that he's in Kilmainham, and sends through some Welsh guards who are well paid off, some bolt cutters, and after 4 nights in a row of trying to cut the bloody bolts, they get the bolt cut and he escapes. So otherwise he would have been shot the next week for one of the IRA events that had happened in Cork. Macroom, I think it was the Macroom ambush. So they were looking for somebody to hang for Macroom. So again, it was another fortunate occasion in escape in his time was it just came at the right time. When he escaped, they went back to the original assignment. Mulcahy and Collins were reorganizing the IRA to make it into a more effective structure. I mean, now, throughout the country by 1921, at the time of the truce, there were possibly, the number varies greatly, 40 to 50,000 soldiers, at least on the register list for the IRA, divided up into all different functions, parade, companies, brigades, etc. So they thought of how can this, and brigades were very, very independent. They didn't particularly like headquarters. They wanted to have a better structure for this. And so they thought up the concept of having divisions. Divisions would then have 3 or 4 brigades. And Father was given, Liam Lynch was given the 1st Southern Division, which is the lower tier of the country. Father was given the 2nd Southern Division, which would be East and Mid Limerick, Kilkenny, 2 of the 3 brigades in Tipperary. And there was various other divisions up. So under his control, he had at that time about 7,000 soldiers, volunteers. How active any one of those soldiers were varies, but that was the way that their structure was. I mentioned the escape from Kilmainham, just to give you some perspective. That door is a good sized door, but you can see that the wall on top of it. And if you were on the other side of that door, looking up and having had a string or rope ladder thrown over it, and it's coming, and you start pulling on it, and you can't get it down low enough so that you can mount it, and it breaks, you can just imagine what he felt. Then he went to the bolt cutter, and for 3 nights in a row, it failed. So he knew that if he went back up those stairs, he was going to be shot within a week or so, but there was no way to get out, so he dutifully had to go up, and the next couple of days, and the next night, try it again. Eventually it worked, he got out. The RIC Dublin Castle didn't realize who O'Malley was until, and that he was even on O'Malley. They recognized that they wrote a letter to his brother's commander. Now, his brother was in East Africa at this time, and he wrote a letter to the officer in command of the British forces in East Africa, inquiring as to the whereabouts and disposition of Francis Malley, as to whether he might be able to tell them where his notorious brother was, and if he might be in a mind to cooperate with the authorities to come home and discover him. Anyway, that letter never got to Frank because he died, and when you can see the image that they had taken of my father in Kilmainham in that February when they didn't know who he was. Anyway, so we're now up to, he's out, suddenly in the midst of the Irish struggle for independence, there's a truce declared. People down the country didn't understand why there's a truce. And there was a big disparate feeling between the city boys, the generals who were fighting with Collins, and the lads who were down the countryside. So there was Michael Kilroy, who by this time was just becoming officer in charge of the 4th Western Division. Father was the 2nd Southern Division. Lynch was the 1st Southern Division. So a great percentage of the on the ground Republican IRA soldiers went anti-treaty. When they read the treaty, they went against it. It was the core of those who went, who were all of the same rank level, common generals, were those in Dublin and the Clareman, Michael Brennan, and some other people who were within the pale in the Dublin area. The northern divisions came under Frank Aiken. So again, if you just think of the country, you might have seen some maps, and until recent history, it was even reflected in the political maps as to which party was where in terms of concentration. And some of those traditions have been changed in recent years, but they certainly stayed quite solid for a long time. And so it was the country versus the city in a certain sense. So in any case, the Civil War followed, the IRA starts to split after they just talk about the treaty. Father is with Rory O'Connor on the side of doing something and not necessarily attacking the Free State position, but they remembered 1916. One of the remarkable things of 1916 is the effort that was made, which is you take important buildings, GPO, forecourts, buildings of significance that people will remember, and perhaps not wish to attack. Now, if they'd learned a lesson in 1916, they realized that that didn't really matter because people will attack a building. And the fact that you were in a forecourts and had the national records behind you is no way does that going to say people are not going to attack you. On the other hand, what happened in the forecourts is the reality was, well, if you are Winston Churchill sitting in London watching the forecourts be taken over by rebels, you say, who is running the country? So Collins was called over to London, was told that this is indefensible. Not only is, as Ernie O'Malley kidnapped, your number 2 in the army, who was Ginger O'Connor, who was kidnapped, and also Harold Wilson, not Harold Wilson, General Wilson was assassinated by somebody, not naming who it was because they didn't know at the time. So there were major events happening within Irish society over which, if you looked from the empire's perspective, you would say they're out of control. They don't know, they're not running the country the way that we expect them to do. And so if Michael Collins doesn't do what he should do as an effective executive of the country, we will bring back our generals. So that was a real potential threat. So Collins sort of said, it's my responsibility, I will step up to it, and he comes back and he attacks the forecourts. What happens in the forecourts, my father had tried to get the senior management of the anti-treaty troops out of the forecourts. For whatever reason, history sadly will reflect that none of them left, and they were all captured and marched off to prison. Father himself was captured and marched off to prison, but he and Sean Lamass and a couple of other fellows happened to get into a Jameson distillery where they were all sent for 2 hours before being taken to Mountjoy jail, and he found that one of the doors was loose, and he just walked out into an alley with Sean Lamass and escaped. So what happened then was, because the senior management of the anti-treaty group were all in jail, Liam Lynch, who had been rejected by the anti-treaty people and canned, had taken off for court to sort of go home just in case something happens. He hears about what happens, and he assumes leadership of back as chief of staff of the IRA. And he appoints my father, who is one of the youngest people in the IRA executive, as number 2. So he's the assistant chief of staff for about 5 months, and they try to run a campaign of whatever they can try to do in attacking what is now a fairly well-established army, the Free State Army. And as those of us down in the West know, that they got a ship to go down into Fennet and attack Kerry. They got a ship under Michael Ring, was it, who came into to Westport and proceeded up to Castlebar and over here into Newport. So they started conquering territory by driving the Republicans up into the hills, basically. And shortly thereafter, basically it collapsed. Father was captured in November. The management on the Republican side certainly cannot be said to have been great. They were understaffed, underpaid, not doing effective counter work, and it was simply not effective. Anyway, when he was captured, in terms of his own personal story, he was wounded severely, 10 or 12 wounds in his body, given up for dead, so to speak. The Free State wanted to shoot him, as they had shot Erskine Childers in November when he'd been captured. But they remember that James Connolly had been captured and had been shot, and remembered that Connolly was injured. And so there had been a big backlash against shooting an injured man like James Connolly, and so they decided not to shoot my father, but it actually was a procedural element. They were trying to be more lawful than the British. What you would do is, if you're an accused, you have to be well enough to stand trial. So one of Father's classmates, who was Matthew O'Connor, father of Ulick O'Connor, signed every day a little slip of paper which said that the accused is not capable of standing trial. And of course, when my father heard about this, he was absolutely disgusted with his former friend, because he said, please sign it, because he wanted to be shot. Namely, this was the heroic coming out. remembering the blood sacrifice, remembering what, saying that if they shoot me, then they are really going to be answerable. Because shooting an injured person will have the backlash that James Conner had. So anyway, he was put off into hospital. Over the next 2 years, he suffered greatly as his wounds sort of recovered, but not fully. He was elected to the Dáil in 1923 from jail, as were many other people. The 41-day hunger strike, and by the time he gets out in July 24, he's just a physical wreck. And he says at the end of his book, Singing Flame, when they got out of jail, they had to take up the threads of the inscrutable destiny, some to begin life all over again. And if some of you might know through your families and other friends and reading, what happened to the Republicans in July 1924 was basically many of them had skipped their education, many of them had suffered greatly in health. At the same time that the IRA were being let out of jail, the Free State Army was being demobbed. So if you were an employer in the local economy, you would take who first? You would have pressures applied to you, both from all of the areas that you can imagine that apply pressure and social conditions, to employ Free State or pro-Free State children, as opposed to those who took up arms against the state.